So welcome. Thank you very much indeed for tuning in. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak as well. I'm a landscape archaeologist and historian by training, but the work of J.M.W. Turner has figured large in my personal interests and also in my professional interests for many, many years. Not least in the West Country area where I grew up, but also since relocating to East Anglia in the early 2000s, a growing interest in his East Anglian work as well. And it's that I want to share with you this evening. I should also say that it's always a pleasure to visit Lowestoft, even virtually. My father's family are all from Lowestoft, and I have many happy childhood memories of holidays spent in the town. And so it's always a pleasure to be able to support work going on in the town. Always nice to be involved in that, and very much looking forward to seeing the town hall reborn as a result of the current project. So this evening, as I say, I'd like to share with you the work of a man who I would argue at least is really Britain's greatest artist, J.M.W. Turner. That's obviously a controversial viewpoint in and of itself, particularly when working in Suffolk with his main professional rival and contemporary, John Constable. And the pair of them, as we'll see on the way through this evening, share much in common, but also incredibly different in terms of their approach to the artistic world, their artistic style, and particularly the artistic landscape. And so I'm going to begin just with a few biographical details for Turner himself and Turner the man, as opposed to Turner the artist, particularly, and then show you some classical examples of his work before zooming in on a particular episode of work that he did within East Anglia, focusing on the East Anglian coast especially, and producing a series of images of a variety of our coastal towns, Lowestoft not least. And on the way through, I'm going to include a discussion of the wider context within which he was undertaking this work, which gives us a view into the emerging art markets of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, hopefully you can all see my slide changing. Yeah, here we go. It's changed. That's good. So J.M.W. Turner, then Joseph Mallord William Turner. You can see at the top of the screen there his date, 1775 to 1851, a very long and productive life, which spans the end of the Georgian period and into the first half of the Victorian period, a period of immense social, political, economic, industrial, scientific change. An enormous amount occurred during the course of Turner's lifetime, and all of that had a direct or indirect impact upon his work and his inspirations. And again, we'll touch on that as the evening goes on. The painting you can see on the screen here is a masterly oil painting, a self-portrait of his painted in 1799, coming up to 24-25. And this is him staring boldly out of the canvas and challenging those who judge him for his relatively young age, and also those who are starting to judge him for the quality and style of his work, shall we say. Now, of course, if there's a measure of importance and greatness in Britain, it's appearing on a stamp. And here we're looking at a set of commemorative stamps produced 50 years ago now, 1975, to celebrate Turner's 200th birthday. And you can see here back in the day when a first-class stamp would cost you, a princely 5.5p. It's hardly changed at all. But you can see here a selection of Turner's different styles of work there. Some of these images we'll come back to later on. The quality of the reproduction reflecting their mid 1970s origin. Of course, now, as I'll mention in a moment, we're celebrating the 250th birthday. We've just finished celebrating 250th birthday last year. It's now Constable's 250th birthday this year. And again, I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. But it's not just being commemorated on stamps. Turner has also been commemorated in cinema as well. Many of you may have seen it 10 years ago or so now, may have seen Mr. Turner, a Mike Leigh film starring Timothy Spall, which again is very much focused on Turner the man rather than Turner the artist, and is an incredibly interesting and well acted and well designed, well delivered biopic of the man himself. And of course, Turner is so famous, and his paintings are so ubiquitous, so well known, that it's possible even to have, as you can see on the screen here, an episode of In Our Time on Radio 4, one of the great programs. Of course, Melvin now retired, but Misha having taken over in the last couple of weeks. And here, so well known are Turner's paintings that it's possible to dedicate an hour of radio time, where of course there aren't any pictures, to talking about one of his most famous paintings, The Fighting Temeraire. And this is an image which, again, we'll come back to as the evening goes on. But the point being, again, that they always say the pictures are better on the radio, and in this particular case, that turns out to be true. And of course, in addition to stamps, we have that other major epithet that is a sign of greatness, and that is appearing on a banknote, of course. And now, since 2020, it's possible for all of us to own a Turner of our own for the princely sum of £20. And you can see held up for the screen here that famous self-portrait that I've already shown you, which is blurred in the background there, has been reproduced on the £20 note, along with the Fighting Temeraire, which I've also just shown you. And so again, you can see Turner there being celebrated as one of, if not the greatest, then certainly one of the most well-known of Britain's artists. And I mentioned that it was his birthday last year. Happy birthday, Turner. And I mentioned that it's Constable's birthday this year. And so we're seeing in the Tate Gallery down in London, which holds a lot of paintings from both artists, a major exhibition being placed at the moment. You can visit it now, it's open now. Turner and Constable, the definitive exhibition. If ever you needed to go to an exhibition, this is the one. And this one is setting up and juxtaposing the two different styles of work of Turner and Constable. The one of them very flamboyant and international, the other arguably more traditional, more parochial, both working in parallel and really set up as professional rivals, but really contemporaries and fellow artists at the same time. So again, an incredibly interesting insight into the pair of them, not least because of the East Anglia connections, which we'll talk about. Now, Turner, it's fair to say, is a prodigy. He's a child prodigy, and this is recognised as by his parents from a very young age. His father is a barber working off Covent Garden in London, and very early on he starts to exhibit his son's work in his barber's shop, and it comes to be recognised. The image on the screen here is Turner's first watercolour to be accepted to the Royal Academy, into their annual exhibition, which is no mean feat in and of itself. More so when you consider that this was in the exhibition in 1790, in the month that he turned 15. So this is 15-year-old Turner. I think what I was doing when I was 15-year-old, not quite so good. But this is the point, is that Turner, from a very young age, is an incredibly accomplished artist in many different ways, not least in the use of watercolours, which is what we see him starting out with here. And in this image, lots of the themes, which we'll come back to in some of the East Anglian images a little bit later on, we're looking at important historic buildings, in this case, the Archbishop Palace in Lambeth. We're looking at the use of light and shade to create 3 dimensions on the buildings themselves. We've got perspective as the building tapers off towards the right-hand side of the frame, for example. But crucially, we've also got people in the scene. It's a human story being told against a background of historic buildings. So on the one hand, this ticks the boxes of the topographic landscape in terms of recording the architecture and the historic building. But then at the same time, it's telling a story. In fact, it's telling several stories. You've got the couple walking in the foreground there. You've got if I can click the laser pointer on, I can show you. Hang on. So in the background here, you've got a boy courting through the window of the palace here. And then right in the background, you've got someone mending a small boat ready to take it out onto the river, as well as a variety of dogs and people in the middle distance there as well. And so again, lots of different stories being told in that same image. And this is one of the really important things about Turner's paintings, is that at this particular point in time, a lot of his contemporaries are painting fairly static landscapes or fairly static pictures of buildings. Turner brings those to life by really backgrounding the buildings and the landscapes and having that human story being told. And that's something that we'll see in lots of the East Anglian examples as the evening goes by. Now, having seen his first watercolour exhibited at the Royal Academy, this then is the first oil painting which Turner exhibited. This is 1796, so 6 years later. And again, we can already start to see many of those themes that we come to recognize as being typically Turner. You have, stormy weather, particularly, or churning sea being beautifully rendered here in the foreground. You have the moon rising through the clouds in the background. And then you have that human drama being played out again. So it's Fishermen at Sea is the title, and you can see the details of the boats being picked out there. You can see, again, it's this recurring theme that we see in Turner's work, which is the struggle of people against the natural environment, and particularly people fighting the waves and the sea, especially, as a theme that Turner comes back to again and again. And then at the same time, very dark, very moody, fading to black around the edges of the frame. But then picked out in the just off the centre of the frame there, the lantern being held by one of the sailors, and sort of a burst of light in the darkness there. And again, this is a trick that Turner uses a lot, juxtaposed in this case with the full moon bursting through the clouds behind. And again, these are tricks that we see being used throughout Turner's career, but particularly on many of the East Anglian images that we'll come to. This battle against the elements, this survival of the sea, is something that is writ large in many of his paintings. And then as we get towards the later part of Turner's career, we perhaps end up with some of the more familiar paintings. And when we talk about Turner, when we think about Turner's paintings, these are much more the kinds of things that spring to mind. The watercolours are less well known. The large oils are particularly famous. This is the burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons, painted in 1834 or 1835. Very likely to be painted as a result of Turner having actually witnessed this episode. And again, you can start to see some of those themes we'd already picked up in his earlier work there. You've got the historic views, in this case, a historic event being depicted. You've got the bridges there and so on. But you're starting to see that beautiful use of colour, the yellows and the oranges, and the swirling of the flame into the clouds that we start to recognise as being much more typically Turner. But at the same time, still, we've got that recurring theme of it being a human story and a human drama. So while the eye is drawn to the conflagration at the back of the frame, in the foreground, you have crowds thronging the riverbank. You can see them all. Once you get your eye in, you can start to pick them out in quite some detail. Right in the foreground and along the bridge to the right-hand side. And then you've got boats out on the river as well, watching the spectacle. So again, it's the event being depicted in the background, but with that human story, that human interaction writ large in the foreground. Other more famous images, again, I said Turner is working during this period of immense change and particularly industrialization. And whereas Turner was a constable, really, looks back into the more traditional views of rural England and kind of the agricultural idyll, Turner is much more engaged in, for want of a better word, progress and the development of new technology, such that here we see in the center of the frame here a steamboat. And you can make out the paddles. I'll show you here. There's one of the paddles here, and the other would be on the other side of the ship. And you've got a funnel here belching steam up out of the center there. And this is in turn then mixing with that maelstrom of the sea swirling in the foreground and the sky swirling at the top to create this wonderfully evocative swirling image with the ship steaming away in the center there and battling the elements. And again, you've got that notion of human drama. You've got that notion of battling the elements and technology fighting against the forces of nature in the center of the frame there. So one of his very late images, this one particularly, and one of the ones that featured on the stamps 50 years ago. Another very late image, which again has similar themes, is Rain, Steam and Speed, the Great Western Railway, which if you look at the left-hand side of the painting, for example, is very much a kind of typical Claudian style classical landscape with a viaduct and a river and a sort of woodland glade beyond. But then in the right-hand side of the screen, you have, of the frame, you have the great hammering through of the railway viaduct coming towards the viewer, and then hammering along the railway, you've got the steam train ploughing forwards, heading towards the front of the frame. And of course, this is reminiscent of some of the later scenes that we see in early cinema, for example, with trains coming towards the screen and the audience being horrified that it might break through. Again, early on, mid-19th century, you've got Turner trying to play the same tricks there in oil. And again, a very impressionistic style as well. We've got some details picked out, such as the blackness of the funnel of the train there, for example, but the rest of the landscape, the rest of the sky is this swirling mass of suggested form and suggested weather, which again is absolutely typical of particularly late Turner. And of course, in retrospect, of course, we all recognise, I hope we do at least, that Turner it was, and his work continues to be, that of a genius. But his contemporaries were less sure. This was, as is always the case, with someone who's breaking the mold in this way. It's difficult to be certain at the time necessarily that are they a genius or are they insane? It's a very fine line at times. And so we see a variety of different contemporary images of Turner, which reflect these different viewpoints. And many writers comment on his style and his paintings during his lifetime. So here, for example, is a portrait painted of Turner at the Royal Academy on Varnishing Day, late in his life, capturing his short stature and his top hat and his frock coat, which is a very typical of his dress. He's very well known for dressing in this way. Varnishing Day is the day at the Royal Academy where they just finish off the paintings and then just varnish them ready for exhibition. And here he is fully engaged in that process. But then at the same time, as well as we've got these sort of idolizing portraits of Turner at work, at the same time, we also have this. This is produced in the same year, but it is a caricature titled Turner Painting One of His Pictures, 1846. And here, instead of the kind of idolized view of the Varnishing Day, you can see a very short Turner standing at the easel with a mop in his hand and a bucket of yellow paint at his feet. The suggestion being that he's just slopping the paint onto the canvas with a mop. So again, in those two images, really, you have both ends of the spectrum. And I mentioned it's writers as well. It's not just the caricatures and the portraits. And we have the diary of Benjamin Robert Hayden, who is another contemporary of Turner's. This is his entry in one of his entries in his diary from June 1829. Turner's pictures always look as if painted by a man who was born without hands, and having contrived to tie a brush to the hook at the end of his wooden stump, he managed by smudging, bungling, scrawling, twisting, and splashing to convey to others a notion of his conceptions. Quite a damning review from a fellow artist, although in hindsight, of course, who really has ever heard of Benjamin Robert Hayden? But the point is that Turner is a prolific artist in his day, and he's obviously famous for the large oils that come down to us through the national collections, have ended up in the Tate Gallery and the National Gallery. But really, they are very much the tip of a professional iceberg, shall we say. The Turner bequest, which is held in the National Gallery, is an enormous collection of material and comprising literally tens of thousands of watercolors and oil paintings and whole reams of sketchbooks. And we're particularly fortunate that the Tate Gallery that holds them has digitized these images over the years and has scanned the sketchbooks and made them available online, so that now it's possible to leaf through a large number of Turner's works digitally, which is not something that we used to be able to do. And I've been studying Turner for about 30 years now. And when I started, you had to go to the Tate Gallery, actually order up some of the watercolors, order up the sketchbooks, and physically look at them in person. And today, that's completely changed. And it means that all of you, can very easily examine this material too without any great difficulty to yourselves. But what I want to focus on really for the rest of this talk, using East Anglia as the main example, is what Turner was doing for the majority of his career, because he's famous for those large individual portraits and landscapes especially. But really, the economic powerhouse that was driving his career, if you like, was a much more commercialized art market, which had emerged during the course of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and which Turner, as one of the foremost artists of the day, was well placed to capitalize upon. And what that required was for Turner to travel extensively throughout this country and throughout Europe, sketching as he went. And here's a sketch of Turner from late in life, again, capturing his stature and his costume, as you've seen in the previous paintings, but in this particular instance, with sketchbook in hand. And one of the really nice things about the Turner bequest and all of the sketchbooks that sit within it is that we can see different episodes of his life recorded in different books. And we can see how single episodes recorded in a sketchbook then influenced whole generations of paintings, one after another, for many years to come. And East Anglia is no different for that. Now, as I say, Turner travelled prolifically. But of course, when we get to the later part of the 18th century and into the early part of the 19th century, traditional travel on the continent had become much more difficult because of the Peninsular Wars, especially ultimately culminating in the Battle of Waterloo. But it meant that for a period of some 20 or 30 years at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, it wasn't possible to travel as easily on the continent as people had previously. And so things like the Grand Tour of the Mediterranean, of Rome and Greece, for example, weren't possible. And so people turned their attention much more to Britain and to the British landscape, especially at this same period. We start to see the emergence of archaeological societies and museums, and that growing interest in antiquarianism and British heritage in particular. And Turner taps into that market by producing series of paintings of different sites and monuments and landscapes, which are quintessentially British, and feeding those into this emerging art market. Now, we're fortunate because although Turner was a fairly private man, we do have a number of accounts that survive of people who travelled with him at various points. And particularly, I mentioned my early work in the West Country on Turner. We've got some very nice descriptions of his travels through the Devon landscape, especially where he travelled with a local journalist who recorded the experience of seeing Turner completely mesmerised by the landscape around him. And he recalls different episodes in Turner's working practice, including standing under a battery of guns as they fired over his head out of the Royal Citadel in Plymouth, for example. He talks about him sitting transfixed in the bows of a boat during a storm while other sailors were horribly seasick and wished to be thrown overboard. Turner is sat in the front of the boat sketching the storm, for example. We have numerous different examples of his dedication to his art, and we see that reflected in the paintings. And it's very likely that he's witnessing some of these storms firsthand, and that the swirling seas that we see are seas which he personally has experienced. Now, of course, a lot of the sketchbooks are pencil, but there are also sketches in watercolour as well in some of the sketchbooks. And the Royal Academy now curates Turner's travelling watercolour box, which has come down to us, which is a beautiful little thing in and of itself. But as part of the collection, they also have this, which is Turner's collapsible fishing rod as well, which again gives you another insight into the man. His passion for angling and eating fish is something which he was doubtless able to capitalise upon during his time in East Anglia. And so then I mentioned East Anglia, we then come to the East Anglian material itself, and particularly the model that Turner is working in. And the model that he's working in is quite simple. He's approached by a publisher who has a concept of producing a part work, an artistic work of a series of images depicting different scenes across the British landscape. And they commissioned Turner to then produce a series of watercolour images which will be reproduced and published in this series. But it's not the watercolour images themselves which are being printed and produced. The watercolours form a source material for a series of engravings which are then produced. And it's the engravings which are printed and published in the part works. And the watercolours themselves are then sold very often into private hands and then become part of the private art market. So you've got different layers of society being catered for. You've got the people who want to own the original watercolours at the top, and then running down that hierarchy, you have people who want to own high quality prints from the early use of the plates on good quality paper. And then as the plates gradually degrade, you get poorer and poorer quality prints as time goes by. And so Turner is constantly producing material to feed into this market. And that's the context within which the East Anglian material sits. Now, Turner's first encounter with East Anglia is really literally an episode of sailing by, if you like. We know that in 1822, Turner sailed from London to Edinburgh to be the royal to sketch the royal visit, the king's visit to Edinburgh. So he was essentially the recording the royal thing, sort of equivalent of being a photojournalist, I suppose, in the day. And during the course of his voyage, Turner sails from London to Edinburgh. He sails past the East Anglian coast. And so a couple of pages in the sketchbook that Turner uses for the journey to Edinburgh, the rest of the sketchbook is full of pictures of Edinburgh. But there's 2 pages here where he captures the East Anglian coast. I'm just going to switch the pointer on again. Now, this is done in the form of a running section. So essentially, it starts off at the south. You've got the sea at the bottom and the cliff top at the top. and it runs along as it goes past. And so he's got little annotations on here. So this one, as we come past here, this one here says Orford Castle. And you've got this very, very stylized little image here of Orford Castle on the one hand and Orford Church on the other. And it keeps going on, and it says wood over here, giving you an idea that there's wooded cliff tops. Now we also have here Orford Nest recorded as well. So you've got the Orford Nest Lighthouse here and the Orford Nest low light there. We'll come back to those a little bit later on as well. The coast continues along here. Here you've got Aldeburgh picked out, so you've got the church tower, and you've got Aldeburgh just written in there. This little label here says Southwold, which is just in there. And then as we go on to the top of the next page, you have a little sketch running through, and you can just about make out, slightly blurry, but you've got Lowestoft written in here as well, just giving you that little view there of the town. Again, we'll come back to this in a moment. And then it carries on to the north. So you have these longer views as it heads further north through Great Yarmouth, as we have here. And we have a couple of little sketches of Great Yarmouth, including the Nelson Monument, which we'll come back to a little bit later on. So we've just got these little sort of sweeping views of the East Anglian coast as Turner goes by. And then he carries on to Edinburgh and conducts his other work. But clearly the East Anglian coast has lit something in him, because it isn't too long before he comes back and makes a specific visit to the East Anglian coast. And he does that in 1824, and he produces a sketchbook which contains exclusively images of Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex. And these images are feeding into one of these part work schemes that he's become involved with. And this is the one called The Picturesque Views in England and Wales, which you can see the title page of here. And this is published in pieces between 1827 and 1838 by the publisher Charles Heath, who Turner works with extensively throughout his career, and feeds these paintings into it. And the fact that the paintings are by Turner and then engraved by others is seen as a major selling point for this scheme. You can see that from the title page alone. And so a lot of the East Anglian material that Turner produces then feeds in the first instance to this scheme, along with many other subjects drawn from other sketchbooks. So here is the East Anglian sketchbook. It's a tiny little thing. It's not very big. And again, some of you may have seen it in real life. It was exhibited at the Time and Tide Museum in Great Yarmouth a few years ago now, on display, but had to be guarded the whole time. It's incredibly precious. But as I say, the Tate Gallery have digitized it, so you can virtually turn the pages now from the comfort of your own home like this. So I'm just taking a selection of images at random from the book here, but then showing you some of the watercolors that come from them. And what these sketches serve to emphasize is the fact that Turner he's not sketching in great detail. He's really sketching shapes and outlines and forms, landforms, juxtapositions of one building to another. And these are then embedding themselves in his memory, so that when he comes back to these subjects later on, sometimes many years later on, they're clearly sufficient to be able to reinstate those vivid images in his own mind that he then captures and translates onto paper. And this is suggestive again of his perhaps photographic memory, his immense recall of detail and so on for scenes that haven't really been sketched in that much detail in the sketchbooks themselves. This page that the book is open on in this photograph here is showing you some of the scenes of Aldeburgh that he sketched. And you can see sketched in the foreground here multiple views of the same thing. It's not just one image per page, it's a real composition, compilation of different pieces. So we have here the Martello Tower at Aldeburgh being depicted in a couple of different views you can make out on the left, and then a couple of little street scenes with the church sitting above the town on the right hand side there. And this image of Aldeburgh, this little sketch here, translates into this. And this is what I was meaning about the sort of meager nature of the sketch, then translating into these wonderfully detailed and evocative watercolors. So this is a watercolor of Aldeburgh, Turner spelling in the caption there, which is showing you, again, based on that sketch that you've seen previously, is showing you the view of the harbour mouth. You've got the town behind, you've got the church up on the hill, you've got a mill here as well, and then the Martello Tower on the right hand side here, looming very large, looming very darkly into the frame. And this in many ways is seen as being symbolic of the looming threat of the wars that had happened, and how the Martello Tower is there to perform a military function. And then at the same time, you've got the capturing of the bustling nature of the port itself, But in the foreground, it's those human stories that are being played out. So here you have people pulling nets from the water, trying to pull this mast back together and tie it on. This one's got a hammer in his hand, ready to fix this that's going on here in the foreground. And then on the right-hand side, again, you can see people rowing up and down the rivers. So a beautiful image in and of itself, multiple layers, beautifully composed and executed in watercolour. And some of those critics that maintain that Turner couldn't paint, for example, or that he was a terrible draftsman, obviously need to take a look at some of these watercolours that clearly demonstrate his technical skill and the ability that he has to convey these scenes in watercolour. And these are relatively small images in and of themselves. You know, these aren't huge either. But as I say, these are really the first stage in the process. So Turner is paid handsomely to produce these watercolours. And the watercolours are then passed to engravers. And this is where the real skill comes in, because in order to reproduce those images and publish those images, they need to be translated from the ethereal watercolours that we see here into a much more definite black and white image, an engraved image. And the skill of the engraver here is absolutely top notch. To create a plate like this would take a year or more. It would go through numerous iterations as it was gradually worked on. And the archives are full of prints of the work in progress. You know, so you get the test prints being made on the way through. And we know from correspondence and indeed from annotated proofs as well that Turner was very closely involved in this process of the engraving and the print production. He was a trained engraver himself as well. He'd spent time as an engraver as a teenager and is familiar with the method, and so is able to have a direct input. And so we see certain changes being made to the composition of images as they are translated from watercolor into engraving in this way, while at the same time capturing the essence of the painting. So these are beautiful pieces of work in and of themselves. Very often the engraver would be paid quite a lot more than Turner in terms of Turner commission for the one painting. The engraver then paid for a year's work essentially to produce an image like this. And then these images, as I said, being produced in high quality from the fresh plates on good quality paper, and then gradually feeding a diminishing return of as the quality degrades over time. So this is an absolutely beautiful picture of Aldeburgh. It's published as part of that picturesque views in England and Wales, which is what that PVEW means in the caption at the bottom there. And it's published in part 3. So there are little parts where you get groups of 4 images at a time being published. And this is one of the images published in group 3, is Aldeburgh, along with views of other places, as it says, across England and Wales. But of course, one of the other things is that Turner visited the East Anglian coast once in 1824 and produced that sketchbook. And I've shown you the page for Aldeburgh, and that resulted in the image you've seen previously. But then Turner came back to the subject matter again and again. So a few years later, 1827, he's producing other watercolours. So he's produced the one that you've seen engraved on the previous slide, but he also then, for other schemes and other ideas later in life, starts to come back to that same source material and produce variations on a theme. So this is another image of Aldeburgh. The print quality on this one is less good because this is a watercolour which has gone into a private collection and hasn't been seen for quite some time. And this is a photographic image from the late 70s, early 1980s, included in the work of Eric Shanes, who is a foremost scholar of Turner's watercolours in particular. And this then is reproduced from a book printed in about 1980. And so is lost something in translation. The original hasn't been seen in public for a very long time, so there isn't an up-to-date image available for this one. But again, you can see, you know, the shape of Aldeburgh in the background there, with the church rising above the town in the background. You've got the Martello Tower again in the left-hand side of the frame now, but rather than being looming in the foreground, it's sort of backgrounded slightly here again. And the focus of the story here is the ship on the foreshore, which has been pulled ashore, and then all these people and horses unloading the ship and taking the cargo across the beach and up towards the town. So again, a human story captured there. This painting as well began to be translated into an engraving as part of a later scheme that Turner had developed, where he would produce coastal views, but it was a scheme that never came to fruition. And so this is essentially a work in progress, and the work was then subsequently abandoned. So you can see that the quality of the engraving is not as good as on the previous example that I showed you. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why this scheme was less viable, or considered to be less viable, as work continued. Moving on from Aldeburgh, we also have views of Orford. Turner clearly spent a long time, a considerable amount of time in Orford. He sketched extensively around the town. Particularly liked the castle. He sketched the castle in great detail several times, and he absolutely loved the juxtaposition of the tower of the castle with the tower of the church. And this is something he picked up on that coastal view that I showed you earlier on, the little running section of the coast where he just got two little lines for the two. And then when he visited Orford, it was something he sketched again and again. This is a view, for those of you that know Orford, this is from down by the quayside, so looking back towards the town, probably even taken from, or sketched from Orford Ness, looking back across the river towards the town. And so you've got the castle up on the left, you've got the church on the right, and then you've got the masts of some ships in the foreground here. This little sketch view here directly translates into this watercolour. This is another one that sits in a private collection. So again, the print quality is not great on this one, but it gives you again that sense of what Turner's trying to achieve. So you've got the tower of the castle in the background, you've got the tower of the church, you've got the quay and the port in the middle distance, and then a human story in the foreground, people pulling in fishing nets in this particular case. It's slightly blurry on here, but on a clearer version as well. This little blob on the right-hand side is a crab poking his head up out of the water to taunt the fishermen who failed to catch it. This translates into this engraving here. This again is published in that same volume of the picturesque views as the Aldeburgh image that I've showed you previously. So this is part 3 again, different engraver, but you can see capturing the same things. So you've got the castle in the background of the church. You've got all the vertical lines of the masts as well sitting in that frame. You've got the vertical towers, vertical masts in the middle distance as well. Lots of strong vertical lines in the composition, and then lots of horizontal lines in the foreground, picking out the calm of the river. There are the fishermen. And then here on the right-hand side is a bit more detail, is the crab just poking its head up. And so again, you can see how it translates into that kind of image. But what we also have coming from the East Anglian material are things like this, which is seen as being a sort of blocked out sketch for the composition here, just a really quick sort of rough watercolor outline of the main blocks of landscape there, just giving you that sense of how the image might come together with the castle and the church and the river in the foreground. So we have these sort of working composition drawings, some of which are unrecognizable. You can't really work out where they are. And this is thought to be Orford, but could be other places, but it seems to fit the composition of that previous image very closely. I mentioned that Turner painted and sketched Orford Castle in numerous different angles and close-ups. And so here we have, again, some general views on the top left-hand side of the town there. And then on the right, on the bottom here on the right-hand side, you have close-up views of the keep itself. And again, we can spot some of the architectural detailing here. You've also got a little sketch of the church tower there with a cupola on top. So again, they're a useful record of what these things look like in and of themselves, as well as seeing how Turner takes that detail and then translates it into paintings. I said Orford features heavily in lots of his work. Here's a beautiful little vignette that he produced. So the vignette sort of fades to nothing, is an oval shape that fades to nothing, rather than being a rectangular frame, as we've seen in the previous images. This one's part of a group of 4 images that Turner produced based on East Anglia, which are painted on blue paper and seem to be a slightly different subgroup to some of his other material. This one's now ended up in the Indianapolis Museum of Art, as you can see in America. This takes a brilliant method, a logical approach to depicting the castle. So essentially it's thrown into silhouette by the vivid sunlight behind, and yet there's still sufficient architectural detail drawn. And you can see how the sketches that I've just shown you translate into this particular image. A lovely little touch is the fact that the light is then shining through this ruined window in the center of the tower here, just bursting through. And then you've got the suggestion of the church in the background there. And again, this use of strong vertical lines of the ship's masts to pull the image together with a human story in the foreground of people on the water. This one was never engraved. This one remained just as a painting. Is absolutely beautiful, probably my favorite of the East Anglian material. And you can see why Orford was such an inspiration, with all these different aspects of the town there to draw upon. Now, I mentioned in the the sailing by image there, that Turner was also inspired by Orford nests, for example, and particularly the lighthouses. And we have some sketches here again from Orford, the bottom half here showing the low light and the high light at Orford, the pair of lighthouses that work together, with some bollards in the foreground on the quay side, and then a figure in a top hat and a frock coat. And this is seen to be almost a self-portrait, if you like, of Turner standing on the quayside, but Orford looking out towards the lighthouses. Turner, it should be said, is absolutely obsessed with lighthouses. They're a feature which recur in his paintings time and time again. He's fascinated by them as structures in and of themselves, but I think he's also particularly fascinated by the symbolism of them as well, and the fact that lighthouses physically represent an industrialized attempt to fight against the forces of nature. You know, that they're there as a warning. They're there to prevent people from being wrecked in storms and wrecked on the rocks, for example. So they feature very regularly in Turner's paintings. From a historical point of view, again, I mentioned I'm a landscape historian and archaeologist by training. Some of these sketches provide incredibly useful views of some of these buildings which are no longer extant as well. So this is the Orford Nest Lighthouse in the early 19th century, subsequently replaced and now demolished. And so again, it gives us a record of what has been lost to a certain extent, although obviously with a degree of artistic license. The sketches of Orford Nest translate into this wonderful painting here, which is in the University of Manchester's Whitworth Gallery, which has a large collection of Turner paintings, not least because one of the major driving factors in the early art market is the new kind of industrial middle class who are emerging, the mill owners and so on, who are emerging as an elite within society. And one of the things they like to do with their newfound wealth is collect art. And so they end up buying up a lot of these paintings. And so we have a lot of them in particularly the industrial areas in some of the collections of the early industrialists. And we see that here in this particular example. What that means is that paintings like this stay in private hands for quite some time, but that they've recently started to come back into the public collections again, because as they're passed down through families, very often families are donating these to national collections in lieu of inheritance tax. And we've seen several images in recent years come through into public collections as a result of donations to the nation in that way. This is the view of Orford. You can see the themes that were picked up in the sketchbook. So you've got the castle and the church in the background still. You've got the lighthouse and the low light as well. And again, you know, that battle against the elements with being lost by a ship that's been wrecked on the shore. You've got the lifeboats out who are escaping from the boat, but also attempting to rescue the crew and rescue the vessel. And then gathered on the foreshore here in the background, again, you have a crowd gathering in the surf there to witness the spectacle. This translates, again, this is one of the later images that translates into an unpublished engraving. We can see here, again, the quality is not as good as some of the others that we've seen, but it captures that sense of what Turner was trying to achieve with the painting. The crowd is clearer. The glint of light from the lighthouse, for example, is clearer. But you can see why this wasn't considered to be as good by Turner, whose standards were very, very high when you look at some of the quality of the earlier engravings. Moving further up the coast, we come to Dunwich, for example. This is Manchester Art Gallery. So again, that northern connection. This is showing you a view of the ruins of Dunwich on the cliff tops, as you can see here, within the raging sea in the foreground, and a crew putting out to sea in a rowboat, presumably to rescue whatever's going on outside the frame here. And you've got that idea, again, very much like the Greek tragedy, where all the big scenes and the big tragedies take place off stage, and you have to imagine what's happening. Here, there's that dramatic tension being created in that the whole focus of the painting is actually outside the left-hand side of the frame with whatever's going on in the raging storm off the sea. And you've got a crowd on the foreshore on the right-hand side here gathered to watch. And again, you've got a boat putting out there. So very similar to some of the themes from the Orford image that we saw previously, but set this time against the background of Dunwich. And Turner would have loved Dunwich. He obviously visited, he sketched it. We've got pages in the book that reflect that. But he clearly loved Dunwich, and he particularly liked the metaphor that was Dunwich, in terms of the fact that an entire medieval city can be lost to the sea in this way, you know, and that erosion and the power of the sea was such that it could wipe entire cities from the coast there. You know, again, that theme of the futility of the struggle against nature is something that we see coming through Turner's work again and again. This is the engraving that was produced of the same, again, not really finished, never really published, but it just clarifies some of the details that we can see from the sketchbook and from the watercolour. It's interesting to note here as well that this emphasises some of Turner's artistic license and the fact that he wasn't just creating perfect scenes, because the church depicted on the cliff top there, given the orientation of the cliffs and given the standard orientation of churches, is of course facing the wrong way. We know that the church on the cliff top at Dunwich, the eastern end, was obviously closest to the cliff, but so the chancel disappears over the cliff first in the early 19th century, and it gradually works its way westwards. But what we can see in the drawing there is then clearly picked up in one of the sketchbooks. So here again we have Turner's close-up sketch of the church at Dunwich. And here you can see, if I just skip back a second, you can see how he's taken the orientation of that sketch and essentially dropped it straight onto the cliff top in this particular image to create that composite. So when I say we can use these images as an example of what's been lost or as a historical record in and of themselves, we need to be a little bit careful, because obviously, you know, artistic license is still very much a factor in the composition of some of these images. And that then brings us to Lowestoft itself. Now, this is one of a series of paintings that Turner produced of Lowestoft, based again on the sketchbooks and picking up some of those recurrent themes. It's interesting to note the spelling Lowestoft is the spelling that Turner has written down as the title of the painting, clearly capturing the local pronunciation there as he jots down the name. This is an image which dates from 1835 or so. So as you have picked up by now, is obviously 10 years or so after the sketchbook, after his visit to the town. And you can see here again all of those familiar themes, you know, the battle against the elements, the raging tide, the nighttime scene. There's a thin moon rising over the town, you can see in the distance here. You've got the lighthouse up on the hill. Those of you familiar, I'm sure you're all familiar with the lighthouse. This is the position of it, sat up on the shoulder of the hill with the light through the cloud. And then in the low ground here, again, a second light there, just helping to navigate past the seafront. And you've got a pair of boats here fighting against the elements, probably some wreckage of a lost larger vessel bobbing about in the foreground there. So again, a beautifully evocative image, which picks up on many of those themes that I've shown you in some of the previous images. This one was translated into an engraving that was published as part of that Picturesque Views in England and Wales series. This was published as part of part 22, so they were quite some way into the series by now. This is published in 1837. And again, you can see how it clarifies some of the detail that was there in the watercolour. If I just go back for a second, you can see it clarifies some of that with the people in the boats and so on, with the wreckage in the foreground. But it also highlights the lights much more clearly as well. And again, we know from annotated page proofs that Turner is very heavily involved in just enhancing particularly the white of the lighthouse, the white of the moon, the white of the second light down here. But really the highlight of this image, for me at least, is the beautiful line work on the waves in the foreground, especially each of those intricate lines etched into the plate. And this is what serves to remind you that while Turner can very easily sort of paint these, so I say easily, can paint these swirling seascapes, translating that then into line artwork is an art in and of itself. And you know, really, the as I said before, the engravers working on these are working at the top of their game. You know, these are the best working on these engravings. And you can see as well that this engraving clarifies some of the detail of the town itself that we can see in the background there, with the settlement down on the Deans gradually working its way up the hillside. And this is informed by both sea-based sketches from the sketchbook, but also land-based sketches as well. And so we can see, for example, the composition of the background of that painting in particular is picked out in this sketch, which must have been painted either from the beach looking back or perhaps from a boat looking back. And again, you can see that very familiar shoulder of land with the lighthouse atop it, and then with the Deans and so on sat in the lower ground there to the south of the lighthouse. That same view we see translated into this second view of Lowestoft. This time this is produced in 1827, so this one is much closer in time to the original sketchbook. This is one of those paintings that has recently come back into the public collection, so it's also in the Whitworth Gallery in Manchester. and again was previously in a private collection, is now part of the public collection. And again, here you can see a similar viewpoint in the sense that it's from the sea looking back towards the town. And here you can see, rather than the this is almost the image that comes before the last one in that sense. You can see the full vessels under sail here, fighting against the waves as the storm starts to gather. You've got a larger ship in the background there as well, and then a lightning strike just running through the background of the image there. On the hilltop here again, you can make out the lighthouse sat up on the shoulder, with then the town arrayed behind it. Again, a beautiful image there, and the detail of the lighthouse, especially, again, as with Orford, lots of close-up views. And so in pages of the sketchbook here, we have Turner's drawings of the lighthouse. This isn't the current lighthouse that we know and love in Lowestoft. This is the one before it. And we can see, again, details of the architecture. We've got annotations of some of the colours, white and presumably yellow being highlighted there. We've got some of the heraldic symbols here being recorded in detail. Again, you know, some of these never used for paintings, but he's just recording all the time, you know, constantly making these little sketches. And then just tucked up in the corner of the page, we've got this rather nice little view in and of itself, looking past the lighthouse from the hilltop over the breast of the hill, with the town, the Dean's area laid out beyond, and then the sea beyond that. And that little composition just sat in the corner of the sketchbook page there, then translates itself into another one of these beautiful vignettes that goes with the Orford Tower image that I showed you previously. And so again, you can see the direct translation of that little view from the lighthouse on the hill with the town beyond, to this looking across the sea towards the moon, with the light of the lighthouse flashing there in the foreground. This again, as I say, it's a pair with the Orford image, and it's also a pair with the Orford image in the Indianapolis Museum of Art. You know, they were obviously sold as a pair, kept as a pair, and have ended up as a pair in the museum, which is rather fitting. You know, that's how it should be, really. I mentioned that there were a group of 4 of these images produced on blue paper. This is another. The Orford image and the Lowestoft Lighthouse image I've just shown you have both been cropped to an oval. They're rectangular pieces of paper, but with the vignette in the centre, they look like this one. This is Happisburgh Sands, or as you can see, being spelled phonetically there. So again, as with Lowestoft, you know, a local name being passed on for purposes of illustration. And this is this is Happisburgh up on the northeast Norfolk coast, famed for its erosion again now and then. So another of these sites which would have appealed to Turner. You've got Happisburgh Lighthouse, an earlier version of it, depicted somewhat dramatically on a rather high cliff top. In this one, it should be said. And again, you know, if it weren't for the label, which you can see in pencil here in Turner's hand at the bottom of the page, saying that this is Happisburgh Sands, it perhaps wouldn't be recognisable as an East Anglian scene per se, but it does at least complete the series to a certain extent. Again, we've got some of those very same ideas coming through, with people working down on the foreshore here. You've got ships pulled up on the sand, people taking cargoes off, up in this case probably up through Cart Gap, up towards the higher ground behind. And I said this was in a private collection. It briefly surfaced in 2003, quite a long time ago now, and sold at auction then for £65,000 or so, nearly £66,000, and has gone back into a private collection. But it means that we did get the chance to see this image in all its glory briefly 20 years ago or so, and obviously the catalogue entry for it and everything else, bringing this image back to the public domain. And then the final image in that group of 4 in that the blue vignette series, if you like, is one which, again, if it weren't labelled Great Yarmouth Fishing Boats, is one that we wouldn't necessarily recognise as being perhaps an East Anglian scene or of Yarmouth itself. And again, you can see just a detail of people on the water going about their day-to-day lives, with then a suggestion of the townscape beyond. And Yarmouth, again, is another of the East Anglian sites that clearly fascinated Turner. On his little sketched coastline that I showed you right back at the start, he'd highlighted the Nelson Monument just as a little icon on the coast. And the Nelson Monument, which you can see right at the centre of this particular image, is an important monument in and of itself. Essentially one of the first monuments to Nelson, and stood on the beach to the south of Yarmouth in glorious isolation, as you can see here, as this monument to Nelson. And because of Turner's obsession with naval might, and the importance of the sea and sea battles, for example, the figure of Nelson and the history of the British Navy were very important themes to Turner. And he produced this exquisite watercolour view from the high ground to the south of Yarmouth, looking back across the rivers towards the town in the distance. And then you've got the harbour in the foreground here. It's obviously changed quite a lot today, but this is capturing it in the early 19th century. And it really serves to highlight that the Nelson Monument, which is now firmly embedded in the middle of an industrial estate right towards the south of the town, back in the day stood in glorious isolation on the beach. This image as well was in a private collection for a very long time. 2016, it came up for auction, and you can see there it sold for £866,000 for a relatively small watercolour of Great Yarmouth. The Norfolk Museum Service chose not to buy it, partly because they couldn't afford it, but also because it was a watercolour and so wouldn't be able to be exhibited permanently, because watercolours fade if they're exposed to the light for too long. So it was considered not to be a worthwhile investment. But again, we were able to see this image, we were able to see it photographed in high definition as we've got here, and then it's disappeared back into a private collection. But the image itself has been well known for a long time because it featured an engraved version of it, featured in part 7 of the Picturesque View scheme, which you can see on the screen here. Again, a direct rendering of the watercolour into the engraving there. And this is, again, one of those higher quality images, to the point where you can pick out anchors on the quay side and so on in the middle distance there. And then, of course, the focus on Nelson's monument there too. And we know that Turner was particularly obsessed with the monument because we can look at his sketchbooks and we see what he did. So he would be, here he is producing sketch after sketch of the close-up views of the tower itself, and then the detail of the statue on the top here as well, which again, we've got sketched in. And this page is really interesting because it serves to emphasize quite how Turner's brain worked. Because on the one hand, you have lots of sketches running along the page, but then at the same time, if you turn the page around, you can see that on the same page, running in completely opposite direction, you then have a whole series of these little skyline views from different places, each of them focusing on the monument. So you've got the monument here with the town behind it, for example. Here it is out on the beach on its own, and so on. So all these little composite sketches overlaid on the same page. You know, he's not sketching one thing, sketching another thing, sketching another thing. You know, it's all run in together just wherever he opens the book. And that makes it a little bit difficult to retrace his steps because, you know, in an ideal world, you'd be able to open the sketchbook at page 1 and you'd be able to work through the sketches and be able to follow his itinerary as he went from place to place. But it doesn't work like that. He just seemed to open the book at various different places and then end up just sketching on the page that he came to. So it kind of jumps about a bit when you try to make sense of his journey, and trying to reconstruct the route is one of those sort of ongoing historical tasks that I grapple with in idle moments. But the monument itself, as well as the previous image that I showed you with it from a distance on the beach, also featured in this image at Yarmouth Sands, which again is about the same period. This is another of the beautiful little watercolours. This is in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, where again it's on display and you can go and visit it. And it's showing you that close-up view. And having seen the pages of the sketchbook, you can see why, you know, or where the detail for this particular monument is coming from. Here it is rendered beautifully clearly with a sailor looking on in earnest, remembering Nelson. And then in the foreground here, again, this human story going on. So again, you've got a group of sailors here sat on an anchor. And here you have a guide, a tour guide, telling a story. And here they're a hushed crowd watching them. And the story that's being told is being told with these objects here laid out on the sand in the foreground. And again, it takes a moment to work out what Turner's doing here and what those objects are symbolizing. But if I tell you that these are little model ships, and what's actually being laid out on the sand in front of that crowd is a reconstruction of the battle lines of the Battle of Trafalgar, with the two columns of the British fleet under Nelson, of course. And so if you can see there's the Victory here, here's Nelson's fleet. So if I just skip back a page, you can see the parallel lines here running across the sand. So this is a model models being used to demonstrate the strategy of the Battle of Trafalgar. And of course, the Victory under Nelson, in the shadow of his monument in the previous image. But those of you that know your naval history will know that at the crucial moment, one ship came to the fore and overtook the Victory, which you can see annotated here, is the Fighting Temeraire. And as we know from the previous images and the earlier discussion, the Fighting Temeraire itself, of course, one of Turner's most famous and well-known paintings. And in this painting, you see captured all of those different themes that run through Turner's work. You've got the juxtaposition of the ancient and the modern. So you've got the old battleship, its full title is it being taken and broken up, Fighting Temeraire being tugged to its last berth to be broken up. And so here you have the grand old ship of the line being towed by a squat little steam tug, taking it towards the wrecking yard, with this kind of ethereal, ghostly past in the background, and this horrible black, dark future in front of it there, pulling the one to the other. But you can see how, again, you've got that wonderful mixture of the sky and the sun and the sea, and the interplay there of the different elements coming together. And as I say, that's something that we see running through all of Turner's major works, particularly, and obviously this is one of his most famous. But at the same time, it's something that we see running through what we might call his minor works as well. And obviously, just through the example of that selection of East Anglian images that I've shown you this evening, you can see that the quality of Turner's draftsmanship, both as a sketch artist, but also as a watercolorist, and then his involvement in the engraving market there. You can see those recurring themes of people on the sea, people's engagement with the sea, particularly the battle between the rough seas and the sailors trying to navigate it and survive. You see the physical challenge of surviving that element being made manifest in the use of lighthouses, particularly to warn people of the dangers. You see it in the physicality of the coastal erosion at places like Dunwich and Happisburgh, all that kind of dynamic change being captured in Turner's sketchbooks and translated into those paintings. But you can also see within the East Anglian series there that microcosm of what Turner is doing professionally day after day, of producing those beautiful watercolors in and of themselves, wonderful pieces of artwork in their own right, which are then being sold to finance these schemes of engravings, and the engravings are then being published and sold to this emerging art market. And so again, we can use the East Anglian group, which results from a single sketchbook produced during a single episode in 1824, where he visits the coast for a matter of weeks, and then feeds into this network of recurring and ever expanding East Anglian inspired images, including several of Lowestoft itself, over the coming 2 decades of his life. And so I hope that that has enthused you all, at least for Turner. I know many people don't need to be convinced about the genius of the man or what a wonderful artist he was, but hopefully it opens a window on some of his other work, on some of his lesser known work, of which there are many, many thousands of examples. And as I mentioned on the way through, the Tate Gallery has an extensive digitized online collection of exactly these kinds of materials. The pages of the sketchbooks themselves you can turn virtually now as you go. And as I mentioned, there are literally thousands of images to work through, hundreds of sketchbooks to work through, covering all of mainland England, different parts of Wales, Scotland, and then across the continent as well. We have extensive imagery from throughout Europe. So there are many, many, many different subjects in there which can be studied. But of course, we all know that the most important of those are those produced on the East Anglian coast, and particularly those focusing on Lowestoft. So thank you very much indeed for tuning in this evening. I hope that you have enjoyed the show. And I haven't looked in the chat, but I'm happy to look in the chat if anyone has any questions. And I don't know if you want to chair a brief question and answer session as well, maybe, and see if we can make that work. But thank you very much indeed for coming.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's really great. So, yeah, so I actually had a question about, you mentioned about, I think it's the painting's called Rain, Steam and Speed, the one you mentioned at the beginning. And I was wondering whether this painting, or Turner's paintings in general, had some kind of influence on cinema at all.
Very possibly. I mean, as I mentioned, that one in particular has reminiscences of that early footage of the steam train coming towards the cinema screen. It's again that same trick. Whether there's a direct correlation, I don't know, but certainly the similarities are striking, and the kind of visceral effect that it has on the viewer, and the idea it's coming straight towards you or slightly off the centre, but mostly towards you, is it can't be coincidence. I don't think. I suspect there is a thread that runs through that somewhere.
Sure. So yeah, there's lots of positive comments in the chat, which is
good.
great.
Nice.
So yeah, fascinating talk, wonderful talk, and beautiful images. Thanks so much from
they really
an American
are.
fan of Turner's.
As I say, many of them that have come to light in recent years. We've got high definition photography of them and so on, and is great. There's a few in there still, and again, whenever I do a talk like this, you never quite know. You always hope someone might go, "Oh, I know where that one is," or my uncle's got that one at home or something. You never quite know. But there are still a few that we haven't seen for quite a while, which are out there somewhere, we think, and there may be others, that were produced which have not survived and weren't necessarily engraved. And then mixed in with the Turner archive, there are lots like that Orford sketch that I showed you, which are just the sort of swirls of colour, which are kind of blocking out the scene. And there are quite a few in there, which might be sketches for East Anglian compositions of one kind or another, but could just as easily be almost anywhere. It's hard to tell with some of them.
So if there's paintings that are still in private collections, do we have a good idea of what amount of paintings or sketchbooks are in private collections, or is it almost like an unknown quantity?
Well, the sketchbooks themselves, he kept the sketchbooks in throughout his life, and then at the end of his life, he bequeathed all of his sketchbooks to the nation. So we have all of those in the Tate Gallery now in the Turner collection there, and the same with a lot of his sketches and drawings and so on as well, and indeed many of the engravings, because with the publishers for a lot of these schemes, he fell out with quite a lot of people. He was quite difficult to work with by all accounts, and at various points he bought back the plates for some of these engravings so that people couldn't produce cheap versions of his work essentially. And so we see him sort of trying to buy up as many of the originals as he can. So a lot of the originals of that material do end up in his hands at his death and are then bequeathed directly to the nation. And so in many ways the watercolors are unusual, because many of those are sold in his own lifetime and go into private hands straight away in order to fund the publication. So the publisher pays for them and then sells them and then uses the money to do the printing and pay the engravers and so on. And so in that sense, they're a little bit anomalous, because they go off into private hands and then come back. And as I say, there's a couple. There's one of the Orford ones and one of the Aldeburgh ones, which haven't been seen for a while. I think probably the people at the Tate Gallery do know where they are, but that information isn't really freely divulged. So we don't have high resolution imagery of that. And there's one of the Orford ones particularly where no one seems to know quite where it is anymore. But you never know when these things might suddenly crop up. As I say, in recent years we've had two come up through auction, and another couple which have come into public collections, particularly in Manchester, including the Lowestoft image. The second Lowestoft image that I showed you is a recent reacquisition by the Manchester Gallery. So these things do crop up, particularly through inheritance tax, the tax in lieu scheme, where they can donate objects to the nation and dodge a tax bill. We see them being used for that particularly.
Sure. So let's just check the chat. So we've got a few more comments. So we have Sandra saying, many thanks, really interesting talk. Amazing to think of Turner sailing past the East Anglian coast and making his sketches. Marvellous presentation. Yeah. I was actually wondering, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the things with this is that we've obviously got the sketchbook to give us the subjects that he visited, and he obviously visited Southwold and walked out from Southwold to Dunwich and so on, and there are some of Colchester Castle in there and so on. So we've got some that are recognisable, but there are others which are just could be almost anywhere, little sketches. But what we don't really have, and what I have yet to really find, and this might be something that people come across one day by chance when they're doing something else, is any kind of references to where he was or what he was doing. We've not really ever found any sort of local mentions of Mr. Turner, and he was famous at this point. There's no real mentions of Mr. Turner having visited or stayed anywhere in particular. We don't really have any sort of letters or anything like that. There's no newspaper accounts of any of this sort of stuff, which again, that one of the reasons why the Devon tour that I mentioned earlier on is so helpful and interesting is because he toured with a journalist at that point who wrote a memoir about it. And that kind of gives us an insight into the working practices, which we just don't have from other places. And so, again, you never quite know. Someone in an archive somewhere might suddenly turn something over and find a reference to this, in which case I would be very, very keen to hear about it.
So we have a comment from Louise here, which says, I've had a look at the East Anglian sketchbook online, but the images are quite faint. There seems to be some of Southwold and possibly Cove Hythe.
That's right, there are.
Have you been able to identify them as Cove Hythe, Eastern Bavants?
I think some of the church drawings are Cove Hythe, and he obviously did a circular walk out from Southwold, I think, towards Dunwich and back, and sort of took in some of these other sites on the way. And so we have details of some of the Dunwich Greyfriars architecture and so on. And some of them we're able to piece together and recognise. Some of them he's helpfully annotated, so we know what they are. But then there are others which are more difficult to locate. And I say that's where it's frustrating that he didn't just use the next page when he was working through the sketchbook, because that would obviously make it a bit easier to work out quite where he was going. I mean, I didn't mention as well, but there are sketches in the sketchbook of places like Caister Castle as well, and just a couple of views of that, which he's included, which he didn't then work up into any of the paintings. But the sketchbook itself does include other little bits and pieces for places he visited that didn't then get translated into finished paintings. But there probably is a book in this somewhere that I should sit down and write at some point, but I have yet to find the time to do so.
Sure. I was wondering, his sketchbook method of recording information and then almost memorizing that information and interpreting it, is that a very typical method of trained artists of the period, or is that more typical of Turner?
It's very, very typical of Turner. I mean, insofar as you have sketchbooks from other artists, a lot of them are much more detailed, much more like the finished object. With Turner, they're much more kind of sort of aid memoir, really, rather than out and out detail. We obviously get the details of some of the buildings and so on. You can see that, but really, the compositions are, here's the sky, here's the cliff, here's the sea, and it kind of is as simple as that. With some of them labelled as, sky, sea, cliff, red, brown. It really is just as simple as that. And clearly, there's a phenomenal photographic visual memory in there that's being prompted by these sketches, rather than needing to have everything recorded on paper because he can't remember it. And there's been some interesting discussions recently about, is he neurodiverse? Does he have this sort of attention to detail, this hyper focus, which is allowing him to do this, which is perfectly possible. I mean, it's certainly an interpretation of what we see, but certainly looking at the meager outlines of the sketches, and as you say, on the East Anglian sketchbooks, many of the images I've shown you tonight are digitally enhanced to try and get the contrast between the pencil and the paper, and just so you can see the detail. But on the actual sketchbooks, some of them are incredibly faintly drawn, but beautifully detailed enough to be able to then lead to these compositions. And it's not just East Anglia, the other sketchbooks are like it too. It's obviously the way that he worked.
And he seems to have very little written in there. It's just with the lighthouse, you've just got W for white.
Yeah, so, exactly. Well, he knew what he knew what he wanted. It was enough to remind him of what it was. And in many ways, the fact that with that little section of the cliff, as it's sort of that little, almost like a little running record, and you can imagine him sort of standing on the side of the ship just sketching it as he goes. But he's obviously asking someone on the boat, what's that? What's that? What's that? As they go by. And is then just annotating, that's Aldeburgh, that's Southwold, and so on, and is using the spellings out sort of phonetically. So Lowestoft, for example, and then Hasborough with the ORO ending for Haysborough, which interestingly is how it's spelt on the nautical chart. So potentially someone on the ship is giving him the name as it's spelt on the nautical chart, rather than how you would spell it on the well, not quite the Ordnance Survey at that date, but on the existing maps on land, terrestrial place name spellings. Which is interesting in itself as to quite where he's getting it from. But yeah, I particularly like the way that the accent is captured on Lowestoft there is very nice.
So his really early paintings, when he was 4 14, 15 years old.
Yeah,
Um,
incredible.
did he have any kind of training at that point? You know, when you were
A
talking about how he was
yeah,
using perspective.
yeah, a little, not a lot. I mean, a lot of it is just practice. Yeah, and he starts very young, and yeah, he does attend classes at a young age. They're able to do that, but the talent is there already. You know, the classes are almost as a result of the talent uh, be, rather
Sure.
than bringing it out. If you see what I mean? And the fact that he's exhibiting at 15 is exceptional. You know, and the fact that he's a full member of the Royal Academy by 25, that self-portrait represents the famous one that's on the banknote is one that he paints at the point at which he's accepted to the Royal Academy as a full member. I say he's 24, 25, which is incredibly young. Constable was well into his old age before he got accepted to the Royal Academy. You know,
Okay.
it's incredibly an incredible achievement at a very young age for that.
Yeah. So yeah, he sort of overcame all those barriers, I suppose, too.
Well, they're quite different backgrounds when you compare the two. So, sort of, Turner is the son of a commercial barber based in central London. You know, it's very much an urban upbringing, and you know, in the bustling part of the city. And you compare it to Constable's upbringing in the Suffolk countryside as part of a well-established local family. And you know, Turner travels extensively, and Constable is very local, and they have very different approaches to the landscape. You know, as I say, Constable has this very kind of traditional, almost photorealistic view of the landscape when he's painting. You know, Turner's just completely the other way, embracing new technologies and sort of working towards impressionism almost with the depictions of skies and seascapes and so
on. Oh, yeah. So we've got comments like, great talk, so much detail, many images I hadn't seen. Thank you. Thank you for a very informative and great presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you.
No, thank you. So we've still got room for some more questions. So if anyone's got anything else they'd want to. There's so much you could ask. I think it's just
stunned silence.
I think people are blown away by these images. They are so incredible.
Yeah, they really are. I mean, we're very lucky. And as I say, they're in one sense, they're obviously special to us because they're East Anglian, they're sites we know, they're towns we know, but they're also completely typical and representative of the other things that he's producing at the same period in terms of their quality and the compositions. And as I say, I grew up in Devon looking at the similar paintings he'd done on the Devon coast over the years, including one that was essentially the spot where I grew up, where my parents' house was. And so there's a view looking out over the sea, essentially from our front garden. And yeah, they're absolutely beautiful. They're each and every image is exquisite in its own right. And then when you bring them together in these part works as part of these series, it's absolutely incredible. They're beautiful, beautiful pieces of artwork in and of themselves. And as I say, we're lucky now that we can view them on the computer screen, and we can flick through them at our leisure from the archives. But actually, there's no substitute to going to the archives and calling up the original images and getting them out of the boxes and having a really good look at them, which I did with some of the Devon ones, which was particularly nice.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. No, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time, and it's been a really fascinating, inspiring talk.
Great, thank you.
Nice
I shall bid you good night, and I shall speak to you again soon, I'm sure.
Brilliant. No, well, thank you very much anyway.
No, you're welcome. Take care.
Take care. See you later on.
Bye-bye then.
Bye.